I spent 15 winters protecting a quiet corner of forest where moose came to survive the cold. Then one morning, I woke up to chainsaws. The HOA called it beautification, but what they did was destroy a protected, wintering ground. And what came next? Dozens of moose rampaging down their perfect suburban streets, crashing into fences, garages, and gardens. They called it chaos. I called it consequence. And when the screaming started, they came begging for help from the very man they tried to silence. This is the story of how arrogance tore through a habitat and how nature struck back. When you have lived in one place long enough, the land stops being mere acreage and turns into living memory. Every low ridge, every crooked spruce, every frozen bend in the small creek that threads behind my house carries its own private history written in moss and hoofprint, and the way other people's houses carry memories in wallpaper and old photographs. My history here began with deep snow, absolute silence, and the slow, deliberate arrival of moose. 15 years ago, I bought the very last lot on the northern edge of the subdivision, 2 acres of old pasture that had never quite surrendered to lawn backing, straight up to a long tongue of state-protected forest, thick with willow thickets and black spruce. I had spent 32 years as a wildlife officer tracking migratory corridors across 3 states, mapping winter yarding areas, learning exactly how fast human ambition can smother the wild things we claim to admire from our picture windows. So when I walked the property, for the first time, boots crunching through knee-deep snow, I knew precisely what I was looking at. This wasn't just a quiet place to retire. It was a choke point, a vital corridor, a last winter sanctuary, in a county that had paved almost everything else. Every mid-November, right on schedule, they came. First one shadow detached itself from the tree line at twilight, then another, then 3 or 5, moving with the unhurried certainty of creatures who have never learned to fear deadlines. They looked like pieces of the forest itself had stood up and decided to walk massive, dark bodies' legs, as long and clean as fence posts, breath rolling out in slow silver clouds that caught the last light like smoke signals. They crossed the back fence without hurry, circled once, as though confirming the place still smelled right, then folded their enormous frames into the dense willow brush just beyond my yard. A cow with her knobby-kneed calf the first winter. Then over the years, a small faithful herd that returned every season like relatives who never needed to knock. I never fed them, never tried to make them pets. That would have been not only foolish but fatal. I simply watched from the porch with a mug after mug of coffee gone cold, counting heartbeats instead of minutes, learning their rhythms, the way sailors once learned stars. Their body heat melted perfect oval beds in the snow. Their breath rose in deliberate rhythmic plumes that hung in the air long after they had closed their eyes. In a world that runs on engines and notifications and the constant low hum of human urgency, their stillness felt almost holy. I understood how fragile the entire arrangement was. One signature on a development permit, one majority vote at an HOA meeting, one crew of men with chainsaws on a bright Tuesday morning, and the whole delicate balance could shatter like thin ice under a boot. The rest of the neighborhood never truly understood what lived just beyond their trimmed hedges and motion sensor floodlights. They had moved here for the postcard version of nature-tasteful stone entry monuments, sidewalks that never buckled, holiday light displays synchronized to music you could hear from 3 streets away. My place, with its older cedar siding, deeper trees, and hand-lettered signs that read "Wildlife Camera in Use," was the odd cousin everyone tolerated, but no one quite understood. To most of them, I was simply the eccentric old ranger who talked to the pines and occasionally muttered about buffer zones at block parties. They left me alone because I paid my dues on the first of the month, kept my grass cut exactly to the covenant height, and only went to war when I absolutely had to. That uneasy peace lasted until the autumn the letter arrived. It came on heavy cream stock, the HOA seal embossed in gold like a wedding invitation. Winter Landscape Optimization Initiative, the header announced in confident serif type, a prettier name for scorched earth clearance. The stretch of common ground that ran behind my property land, left untouched and gloriously wild for 4 decades, had suddenly become underutilized open space and visually non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. The board had already hired a landscaping company to enhance the area wider gravel trails, decorative boulder groupings, tasteful low-voltage solar lighting along the paths. Translation bulldozers, chainsaws, and wood chippers were coming to erase the only safe winter yarding area for moose within 5 miles of suburban rooftops. I stood on my back porch that evening holding the letter, while the first snow of the season drifted down in slow, deliberate flakes that melted on the hot paper. Somewhere deep in the spruce, a heavy branch cracked under new weight. I smelled sharp pine pitch wet earth and the faint, unmistakable musk of large animals settling in for the long night. My stomach knotted so violently, I tasted iron. That night, I could not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, under the single lamp, compiling every scrap of evidence I had collected over 12 winters, thousands of trail cam stills, GPS logs, handwritten field notes, even a yellowed 2011 letter from a state biologist praising our corridor as a critical seasonal refugium for alces in an increasingly fragmented landscape. By the time the sky outside turned the color of weak coffee, I had a 47-page packet and an email whose subject line consisted of 2 words in bold red capitals: "Stop protected winter habitat violation pending." Their reply arrived before I had finished my second cup. "Thank you for your concern. After careful review, no legal restrictions have been identified within the proposed action perimeter. The board will proceed as planned in the best interest of the community. We appreciate your cooperation." Cooperation. The word sat in my mouth like a mouthful of rust. 2 nights later, I spotted the big scarred bull at the edge of the thicket, moonlight sliding along the pale lightning bolt scar on his flank. He stood motionless for a long time, ears swiveling, staring at the soft, multicolored glow of holiday lights strung across the rooftops below, as though weighing whether humans were worth the trouble after all. I whispered into the dark voice, cracking with cold, and something heavier. "Hold on, old man. Just a little longer." But the wind that answered carried the smell of chainsaw, fuel, and fresh ambition, and I already knew this was not going to be a quiet winter. The glossy pamphlet landed in every mailbox the following week, thick, expensive cardstock that felt almost wet with self-congratulation. North Edge Beautification Project, it proclaimed in embossed gold foil. Inside, stock photo families in Patagonia vests strolled along sweeping gravel paths, while labradoodles bounded through knee-high switchgrass that would never survive a single Alaskan winter. There were artistic renderings of sunset-lit benches, tasteful cedar signage, and a charming little footbridge over a creek that didn't exist. Nowhere, not in a single frame, was there an antler, a steaming pile of moose droppings, or even the suggestion that anything larger than a squirrel might ever walk those paths. They had already held the required informational sessions and taken the binding community vote. I discovered this when the minutes were posted online. At 3:17 p.m. the same afternoon, the pamphlets arrived. The meetings had apparently taken place at 10:00 a.m. on 2 consecutive Wednesdays' times when anyone with a job, children, or a pulse was somewhere else. The vote had passed 11-3. The 3 dissenting members were listed as absent no proxy. My name did not appear anywhere, not even in the attendance log. That evening, I walked the fence line with a headlamp boots, punching through the new inch of snow. I counted 8 fresh bedding sites, still radiating heat, their edges crisp and perfect. 1 cow and calf had bedded so close to my back gate that their exhaled breath had frosted the lower rail of the fence. I stood there until my toes went numb, and the stars came out one by one, listening the way you listen for a heartbeat when someone you love is slipping away. The next HOA meeting was held in the clubhouse, with its fake river rock fireplace, crackling with canned gas flames, and rows of folding chairs that smelled faintly of bleach and pumpkin spice air freshener. I arrived 20 minutes early, 3-ring binder under my arm like a loaded weapon. Karen Ashburn was already at the podium in a crimson blazer sharp enough to slice bread. She had moved into the neighborhood 3 years earlier, climbed the HOA ladder like it was Everest, and now ruled with the serene certainty of someone who believed chaos was a personal insult. I waited my turn at the microphone, heart thudding against my ribs. "I am formally requesting an immediate injunction on the North Edge Beautification Project," I began. Voice steady only because I had practiced it in the truck. That slope is a documented multi-year winter yarding area for moose. Clearing it in December will displace an entire herd directly into residential streets. I have 12 seasons of data. Karen didn't even glance up from her leather-bound agenda. Thank you for coming, Mr. Halbrook. Your email was received, reviewed, and archived. The landscaping contract falls entirely within the board's authority and has already been ratified by majority vote. I opened the binder. This is a state-designated migratory buffer zone within 150 feet of your proposed work site. I have trail cam footage, GPS tracks, veterinary reports on individual animals that return here every single year. Sir, she cut in, smile thin and bright as a new razor. The only wildlife likely to storm the neighborhood, as you put it, is another raccoon in Mrs. Lang's garbage cans. A ripple of obedient laughter fluttered through the room like startled birds. I held up the topographic map with the red buffer zone highlighted in thick marker. When the first 1,200-pound bull walks through someone's sliding glass door looking for shelter, the liability won't belong to the raccoon. Karen's eyes flicked to the map for half a second, then away, as though it were an embarrassing family photo. That sounds very much like a wildlife management issue, not an HOA landscaping matter. Before I could answer, the microphone went dead in my hand. Someone in the back row had literally reached down and yanked the plug from the wall. The room tittered again this time, with relief. Karen moved smoothly on to the next agenda item, acceptable diameter and ribbon color for holiday wreaths. I drove home with the binder riding shotgun like an unexploded bomb, headlights carving tunnels through the falling snow. That night, I filed an official emergency complaint with the State Department of Fish and Game, attaching every photograph, every timestamp, every frame of a cow giving birth to twins 50 yards from the fence line, while children in the cul-de-sac set off fireworks on the 4th of July. I knew the wheels of government turn like frozen molasses in January, but I also knew the sound of chainsaws carries farther than paperwork ever will. 2 mornings later, the machines arrived anyway. I was standing on the porch at 7:05 a.m. Coffee steaming in the dark when the first diesel growl rolled across the snow like a predator waking up. I jammed my feet into unlaced boots, grabbed my coat, and ran. By the time I reached the property line, the first mature spruce was already toppling its crown, crashing through the smaller trees in a slow, graceful arc that ended with a concussion that rattled my teeth. 2 men in high visibility vests and ear protection dragged branches into an industrial mulcher that screamed like a living thing being fed alive. "Stop!" I shouted over the roar. There are moose still bedded in there right now. The nearest worker lifted his safety glasses, wiped sawdust from his beard, and shrugged. "We got a signed work order, buddy. Take it up with the lady in the red coat." I ducked under the orange caution tape. The bedding sites were empty, but the snow still held perfect body-shaped depressions, radiating heat. The herd had fled only minutes earlier, close enough that I could see the steam still rising. I filmed everything on my phone, hands shaking so hard, the footage jittered until a third worker stepped in front of the lens and threatened to call the sheriff for criminal trespass. By noon, the hillside had been flayed open. Raw earth steamed in the cold like a fresh wound. The air reeked of pine-pitch diesel exhaust and something metallic I didn't want to name. The sanctuary that had taken 40 years to grow was now mulch and tire tracks. I walked home with snow packed into my socks and rage burning so hot my ears throbbed. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the entire way neighbors posting photos of the beautiful progress. That afternoon, a cream-colored envelope slid through my mail slot with the soft finality of a guillotine. Inside was a formal compliance citation for unauthorized entry into an active maintenance zone and willful interference with contracted service operations. My own HOA dues were now carried a $250 fine for trying to protect what was left of the wild. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the letter until the words swam. Then I opened a new folder on my desktop and named it in all capital letters. Moose Defense, Legal Prep. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of fresh-cut stumps and ambition across the rooftops like smoke from a burning church, and every light in every perfect house looked suddenly obscene. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table under the single lamp windows, open so the cold could keep me awake, and built the case like a man stacking sandbags against a flood I could already hear roaring. Every trail cam card from the last 12 winters went into the scanner. Thousands of images, the same scarred bull, returning every November with a new slice across his shoulder. The cow with the crooked left ear, nursing twins in 2014. The yearling that broke its leg on hidden rebar in the old trail system and still limped back the next season because this was the only place it knew to be safe. I printed the best 200 in high-resolution date and time-stamped, then laid them across the living room floor like evidence in a war crimes trial. At 3:12 a.m., I started the phone calls. First, Rick Landers, retired environmental attorney, the man who once kept a developer from paving a salmon stream by burying the county in paper until they begged for mercy. Rick, they just murdered the moose yard. He was quiet for 3 heartbeats. I'll be there at 8 with rye and a legal pad. Next, I called the 2 local reporters who still answered their phones after midnight if the word moose was in the subject line. Then the regional enforcement officer at Fish and Game who only wakes up for catastrophes. Then the state biologist who wrote that 2011 letter. She cried when I described the mulched hillside. By sunrise, the kitchen looked like a command center, maps pinned to every wall, coffee rings on topographic overlays, printer screaming as it spat out another 100 pages of statutes and precedent. Rick arrived at 7:58 with a yellow legal pad under one arm and a bottle of Knob Creek under the other. We worked straight through the day. He read code while I pulled data. We highlighted every line that applied negligent disruption of documented wildlife patterns, reckless endangerment via displacement, civil liability for foreseeable to any reasonable person, the 150-foot state buffer zone, that the HOA had conveniently drawn their plans 6 inches inside on paper and 20 feet over in real life. Rick whistled low when he saw the birth footage. Jesus Halbrook, you've got a maternity ward back there. By dusk, we had a 3-inch binder sat on the table, tabbed and flagged, and ugly with truth. Rick tapped it. This isn't a complaint anymore. This is a guillotine. That same afternoon, the HOA doubled down. A second wave of trucks rolled in taller backhoes, industrial floodlight rigs on trailers, a portable generator that sounded like an asthmatic dragon. They were extending the clearing all the way to the property line, now flattening the slope into what the new sign called a community open view platform. Translation: a parking lot view of devastation. I stood at my fence line in shirt sleeves, despite the cold fists clenched so tight my knuckles went white. One of the contractors, a kid who couldn't have been 25, waved me off the flag line. "Do not cross, sir. Active work zone," I shouted over the roar. "You're pushing an entire herd into the streets. You've already displaced mothers with calves that still have milk on their chins." He shrugged, ear protection already back in place. "Take it up with your HOA, man." I did more than that. I called every contact I had left from 30 years in the field. Biologists, wardens, the quiet enforcement captain who only answers when things are about to go nuclear. I begged, cajoled, threatened, and finally wept on the phone with a woman I'd once pulled from a snowbank after her snow machine rolled. By nightfall, my formal complaint had been escalated to emergency status and stamped urgent in red across the top. Rick and I drafted an emergency request for a full environmental impact review, citing not just habitat destruction, but imminent public safety threat. We attached precedent, the Anchorage trampling that cost a city $1.2 million, Colorado case, where an HOA paid a woman's medical bills after a displaced bull gored her through a plate glass window while she made coffee. We hit send at 11:47 p.m. I stepped outside to breathe and found the night transformed. The new floodlights turned the ruined hillside into a surgical theater, raw earth, glowing sickly yellow stumps throwing long, accusing shadows. The air smelled of diesel and torn roots and something older, something like grief. Then I saw him. Not the scarred bull this time. A bigger one, broader across the shoulders, antlers like a crown of bone that caught the light and threw it back in shards. He walked out of the darkness with the slow inevitability of a glacier stepped over the caution tape, as if it were dental floss, and paused at the edge of the churned earth. He turned his massive head toward the houses, nostrils flaring, and released a grunt so deep it vibrated in my breastbone. It was not a sound of fear. It was a declaration. The floodlights flickered once, as though even the electricity was afraid. I stood on my porch until the cold drove me inside, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted out, because I knew what that grunt meant. The storm hadn't started yet, but the thunder had already spoken. The first real collision happened at 6:42 a.m., on a morning so cold the air itself seemed brittle. I was lacing my boots when the sound came, a low rhythmic whomp, 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 like something enormous testing the strength of frozen ground, followed by the unmistakable shriek of metal giving way. I grabbed my coat and ran. 3 moose were galloping down Willow Drive in full panic, hooves striking sparks off the asphalt. Behind them, 2 contractors in orange vests sprinted with long fiberglass poles, yelling and waving their arms like they were herding cattle. You do not herd moose. You especially do not herd moose in winter, when every calorie counts and every shadow is a threat. The lead cow, a big matriarch with a torn ear, spun around so fast, her hind legs skidded sideways. She dropped her head ears, pinned flat, and charged. The first man never had a chance. Her forehead caught him square in the chest, lifted him clean off his feet, and flung him 10 feet into a snowbank. The second stumbled backward, tripped over his own pole, and crashed through a split-rail fence that exploded into kindling. Then they were gone, vanishing between parked SUVs, breath streaming behind them like war banners. I knelt beside the injured contractor. Blood poured from a gash above his eye. His pupils were wide with shock. "She came out of nowhere," he wheezed. "No," I said, pressing my scarf against the cut. "You chased her out of somewhere. There's a difference." Sirens arrived within minutes. The HOA's response was a single emailed community safety bulletin that warned residents to remain calm and avoid interaction with wildlife. No mention of chainsaws. No mention of the hillside that used to be a forest. That afternoon, they installed the lights. 10 portable LED rigs on trailers, blinding white, aimed straight into what was left of the tree line. The hillside became a prison yard at night, every stump and torn root lit like evidence. I stood on my porch watching the glow stain the low clouds the color of old bone, and felt something inside me calcify. Then, just after midnight, the new bull, the monarch with the cathedral antlers, stepped into the circle of light. He walked the churned earth as if it were a parade ground, slow and deliberate hooves sinking ankle-deep in the mud. When he reached the center, he stopped, turned his massive head toward the houses, and opened his mouth. The sound that came out was not a grunt this time. It was a roar, low-rolling, endless. The sound a glacier might make if glaciers could feel betrayal. It rattled windows 3 streets away. Dogs howled. Car alarms chirped. Somewhere a baby started crying and would not stop. I felt it in my teeth. The next 72 hours were a slow-motion avalanche. 9 separate sightings logged on my cameras alone. A cow and yearling bedded down in the cul-de-sac behind the clubhouse, using a Lexus as windbreak. A young bull nosing open Janet's side gate and standing motionless beside her propane tank like a black statue breathing fire. 3 juveniles trotting single file down the center line of Maple Lane at 4:07 a.m., hooves clacking in perfect rhythm, streetlights strobing across their antlers like a silent disco. Every morning brought new prints, deep splayed ovals, crossing sidewalks, looping around trash bins, cutting straight through flower beds that had taken homeowners 10 years to perfect. The neighborhood group chat, usually full of lost Amazon packages and book club reminders, became a frantic wildlife ticker. Anyone else have giant deer in their yard? Those aren't deer. Those are moose. I just found one staring at my kitchen window, like full eye contact. I'm afraid to let the dog out. Karen remained silent in the chat. So did the entire board. I tried one last time to reach them. I printed the clearest stills from the midnight parade, mounted them on foam board, and wrote beneath in thick black marker, "These are not trespassers. They are refugees." I taped the posters to every bulletin board, every mailbox, cluster the windshield of Karen's white Escalade. By noon, someone had torn them all down. That night, the moose stopped hiding. I was on the porch at 2:14 a.m., breath fogging, when I heard the soft crunch of hooves on crusted snow. 4 animals materialized out of the dark and walked straight across my back lawn like they owned the deed. The scarred bull, the limping female, and 2 yearlings. They circled once, sniffed the air, then folded themselves down in the narrow strip of brush I still had left so close I could hear them chewing cud. I sat on the top step in my parka and watched them settle. Their eyes reflected the porch light in calm amber coins of gold. Exhaustion rolled off them in waves. Not hunger exhaustion from being pushed from having the world shrink overnight to the size of a suburban backyard. I whispered into the dark, "I'm sorry." The scarred bull lifted his head, looked at me for a long moment, then lowered it again and closed his eyes. Trust or simple fatigue? I wasn't sure which hurt more. By the end of that week, the neighborhood had changed its rhythm. Joggers stayed on treadmills. Dog walkers crossed the street rather than pass the wooded edges. Children were called inside at dusk, even when the sky was still light. The silence that settled over the streets was not peaceful. It was the silence of held breath. And still the machines worked. They brought in a track hoe with a grapple claw and began ripping out the root balls of the last big spruce, the ones that had anchored the slope for decades. Each tree came down with a sound like a building collapsing in slow motion. Dust and snow and splinters flew 50 feet into the air. I stood at the fence and screamed myself hoarse. A foreman in a hard hat finally walked over, pulled an earplug, and said, "Look, Pops, I got kids to feed. You want to stop this talk to the lady who signs my checks?" I looked past him to where Karen stood on the new platform, in her red coat, arms folded, watching the destruction, like a general surveying conquered territory. Our eyes met across the ruined earth. She did not look away. She smiled. That smile that said, "I have won." I smiled back. It was not a kind smile, because the war had only just begun, and the moose had not yet finished speaking. The morning the bull walked into the garage, the temperature was 12 below zero, and the sky, the color of a fresh bruise. I was pouring coffee when my phone exploded with messages. "Rick, call me now." "Janet, are you seeing this? Unknown number 911 on Willow Drive. Moose in garage. Serious damage." I was out the door in 30 seconds, boots, unlaced boots flapping, coat half zipped. Willow Drive looked like a war zone photographed in pastel. A full-grown bull, easily 2,000 pounds, had punched straight through a half-open garage door as if it were made of cardboard. He was still inside, panicked, spinning in tight circles, knocking over shelves of Christmas decorations and power tools. A black Suburban sat in the driveway, with its hood crumpled like tinfoil, and the windshield starred in a perfect moosehead silhouette. Blood streaked the snow in long crimson arcs. The air smelled of antifreeze, adrenaline, and terror. Paramedics, 2 sheriff deputies, and a growing ring of neighbors in bathrobes stood frozen at the edge of the scene. One deputy turned when he saw me. "You're the wildlife guy, right?" "I'm the guy who tried to stop this," I said, pushing past him. The bull's eyes were wide black pools, reflecting the garage lights. His breath came in explosive bursts that fogged the entire space. I saw the injury immediately, a deep gash along his front left leg, probably from hidden rebar in the old trail system, now frozen open and bleeding again with every frantic step. I spoke low, the same tone I'd used on orphaned grizzly cubs and cornered wolves. "Easy, big man, easy." He swung his antlers toward me, rack sweeping within inches of the hanging kayak. Tools clattered like gunfire. I kept talking, kept moving forward, one slow inch at a time, until I could reach out and touch the warm hide. He trembled under my palm sides, heaving. 15 tense minutes later, he backed out, on his own, limping badly, and vanished into the trees like smoke. The silence that followed was worse than the chaos, because everyone there knew if a bull that size would walk into a garage, it was only a matter of time before one walked into a kitchen, a bedroom, a child's birthday party. The blood on Willow Drive had barely frozen when Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. Not to confess, to contain. The clubhouse was packed. People stood along the walls, arms crossed, faces pale with the kind of anger that comes after a long, sleepless week of fear. Karen stood at the front in a navy suit this time, hands folded like a funeral director. "We understand there have been some unexpected wildlife encounters," she began, voice syrupy, with practiced calm. "Rest assured, the board is taking additional measures." I stood up in the back row. "This isn't unexpected," I said loud enough that the room went dead. "This is engineered. You were warned in writing, in person, with photographs, with maps, with 12 years of data. You destroyed their only winter shelter, and now we're paying the price in blood and broken windshields." Gasps. Phones rose like periscopes. Karen's smile flickered. "Mr. Halbrook, this is a safety update, not a debate." "Then update us on this," I said, holding up my phone so the screen faced the room. I hit play. The footage was from 3:17 a.m., the night before, a cow and 2 calves walking slowly up the newly paved path behind the clubhouse blinking against the blinding LED lights, looking exhausted and utterly lost. The calf slipped on black ice and fell hard. The mother nosed it up gently, then stood guard while it found its feet again. I had taped a second copy to the clubhouse bulletin board that morning with the caption still visible. "These aren't trespassers, they are refugees." Someone had ripped it down, but not before half the neighborhood saw it. Karen tried again. "We are working with authority." "Which authorities?" a voice shouted from the side. Janet, trembling but furious. "The ones who told you to stop and you ignored." The room erupted. Questions flew like shrapnel. "Why didn't we vote on this? Who approved spending our dues on floodlights that chase moose into our yards? What happens when one of those animals kills somebody?" Karen's second in command, Brent, pale and sweating, whispered in her ear. She nodded once tight. "We appreciate your passion," she said, voice cracking for the first time. "But this meeting is for solutions, not personal attacks." I sat down. I didn't need to say more. Because outside the big plate glass windows, snow had begun to fall again, thick and deliberate, erasing streetlights in slow motion. And through that white curtain, I saw them. 4 moose walking down the main road in broad daylight, heads high, unhurried. Then 6. Then 10. Then more. They moved like a dark river, pouring through the heart of the subdivision, hooves ringing on asphalt, breath glowing in the cold like slow-motion fireworks. One paused at the stop sign, as if reading it, then continued on. A calf trotted to keep up legs, splayed for balance on the ice. I lifted my phone and hit record. This was no longer displacement. This was reclamation. And the entire neighborhood watched open-mouthed as 3,500 pounds of wild muscle walked past their SUVs and recycling bins and live, laugh, love porch signs, as though the houses were the temporary structures and the moose had always been here. In that moment, something ancient shifted. We were the intruders. They were simply coming home. Within hours, the video I shot from the clubhouse steps was everywhere. Not the shaky, grainy clip you might expect. I had stood perfectly still, phone braced against the railing, and let the scene speak for itself. 28 moose, I counted twice, walking single file down Ridgewood cul-de-sac. At 4:47 p.m., under heavy snow streetlights, flickering on one by one, Christmas inflatables swaying in the wind like drunk sentries. A calf nosing a plastic Santa, a bull pausing to stare straight into the lens with eyes older than every house on the block. No music, no narration, just the slow thunder of hooves and the soft hush of snow landing on hide. By 9 p.m., it had 400,000 views. By midnight, it was on every regional news station, with the Chiron moose Army occupies suburban neighborhood after HOA clears habitat. The internet lost its mind. Moose revenge trended nationwide. Memes exploded. Karen in her red coat photoshopped onto the Titanic as Moose played the string quartet. A viral tweet from a comedian read local HOA tried to cancel Nature. Nature sent a 2,000-pound unsubscribe. Reporters camped at the entrance sign. Drones buzzed overhead like angry hornets. A national morning show called and asked if I would go on live at 6 a.m. I told them only if they let the moose speak first. Inside the neighborhood, the mood flipped overnight from fear to awe to something almost spiritual. People stopped closing their curtains. They stood at windows with coffee cups forgotten in their hands, watching the herd move like a slow brown tide. Someone started leaving apples on their back steps just in case. Someone else dragged an old Christmas tree into their yard, and the moose ate it in 20 minutes, tinsel and all. A little girl on Sycamore Court pressed her face to the glass and whispered, "They're so beautiful, Mommy," and her mother, who had spent the previous week terrified, started to cry. The HOA tried one last desperate flex. They hired a private security company, 2 guys, in a white pickup with a light bar and a can of bear spray the size of a fire extinguisher. The guards lasted 6 hours. A bull walked up to the truck, lowered his head, and stared until both men locked the doors and refused to get out again. The company sent the HOA an invoice with the note unable to fulfill contract due to client-induced wildlife escalation. That same night, the calf with the broken leg made the news again. It wandered up Brent's sloped, icy driveway just after dusk, slipped, and went down hard. The crack of bone carried 3 houses away. The mother arrived seconds later, ears flat, hair raised along her spine, standing over her baby in full defensive posture, while the calf screamed a sound none of us will ever unhear. Neighbors poured out in robes and headlamps. Someone called 911. Animal control arrived but wouldn't approach. The sheriff's deputy radioed for guidance and was told to stand by. I got there as fast as I could. The mother locked eyes with me across 20 feet of snow and held the stare. I saw exhaustion terror and something fiercer, a promise that she would die before she let anyone near her injured baby. I walked forward slowly, hands open, speaking the low-nonsense words I'd used on orphaned cubs and wounded eagles. 10 feet away, I knelt. She didn't move. Snow soaked through my jeans instantly, but I stayed. After 5 full minutes, the cow's ears flicked forward. After 10, she shifted her weight, giving me a corridor. The wildlife vet arrived with a dart gun. One soft pop. The calf folded gently. The mother stood guard until the sedative took her too. We loaded them both into the trailer under floodlights while the entire cul-de-sac watched in silence. Brent stood on his front porch in a bathrobe, barefoot in the snow, staring at the blood on his driveway and the shattered retaining wall that had cost him $12,000. He looked 10 years older than he had the week before. The next morning, he resigned. No public statement, just a one-line email to the board. Effective immediately. Within 48 hours, 2 other members followed. The empire Karen had built on paint colors and lawn height cracked like thin ice. That same week, the State Wildlife Task Force arrived, not 2 board techs with tranquilizers, but a full convoy, 3 white Suburbans, 2 stock trailers, a mobile command trailer, temporary fencing coils, taller than a man. They set up in the HOA parking lot like a military forward operating base. The lead biologist, a woman named Dr. Elena Cho, who had co-authored the original 2011 letter praising our corridor, found me on the first morning. "We need your brain, Halbrook," she said without preamble. "You know these animals better than anyone alive." For the next 10 days, I lived in Carhartt and coffee walking every old game trail, with the team pointing out bedding sites, wind patterns, escape routes. We mapped a soft exit corridor down the utility easement, baited it with fresh willow browse, turned off every floodlight in a half-mile radius, and waited. The first moose took the bait on the 3rd night, then 5, then 20. But dozens more lingered stubborn or injured, or simply too tired to believe the world had changed again. One dawn, I found the limping cow and her now-healed calf at the edge of the marsh corridor. The little one detested its leg wobbled, then took 3 brave steps into the reeds. The mother looked back once straight at me, ears forward, eyes calm, and I swear she nodded just once before she followed her baby into the green. Something inside my chest unclenched for the first time in weeks. That afternoon, an envelope was shoved under my door. Hand-delivered, no stamp. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. I was wrong. I was arrogant. I thought order mattered more than mercy. "Thank you for not letting the moose pay for my blindness, Karen." I read it twice, folded it carefully, and slid it into the binder that already held every ignored warning, every torn-down poster, every frame of devastation. Because forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and the land remembers everything. The last bull left on the 29th day. I watched him from the porch just before sunrise. The monarch antlers catching the first pink light, breath glowing like slow incense, hooves sinking deep in the softening snow as he stepped into the marsh corridor and vanished into the fog. 29 days since the first chainsaw. 29 days of shattered fences, dented cars, blood on driveways, sleepless nights, and the slow, inexorable realization that control is just a story we tell ourselves when the wild is still far enough away. When the fog swallowed him, the neighborhood exhaled for the first time in a month. But I did not. I still had work to do. Rick came over that morning with 2 fresh legal pads and the look of a man who had waited years to swing the hammer. We spread everything across the kitchen table like generals planning the final assault, every ignored email, every meeting recording, every photograph of the hillside, before and after every frame, of a calf learning to walk again. Every dollar figure of property, damage, medical bills, vehicle repairs, the security company that quit the $11,400 retaining wall Brent would never rebuild. Rick tapped the stack. "This isn't a complaint anymore. This is a museum of willful blindness." We filed that afternoon, not with the HOA, with the State Department of Natural Resources, the Attorney General's Environmental Division, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and every media outlet from Anchorage to Atlanta. We attached a 187-page exhibit packet and a cover letter that began, on date, the North Edge HOA knowingly destroyed a documented multi-decade winter yarding area for Alsace in direct violation of the story detonated. Headlines wrote themselves. HOA ignored warnings, triggered moose invasion, now faces state investigation, suburban Alaska neighborhood. Held hostage by antlers, how one retiree's trail cams brought down an entire HOA board. National shows flew drones over the restored corridor. A late-night host opened with in tonight's episode of When Karens Attack Nature, the Moose Won. People showed up at my door with pies thank you cards, 6-packs of Moose's tooth beer. A little boy handed me a crayon drawing of a stick figure, me standing between a smiling moose and a house with a red X over it. Caption, thank you for saving my backyard. I became against every instinct the face of the story. Karen tried to hold the line for exactly 8 days. She gave interviews claiming good faith, unforeseeable circumstances, expert landscaping advice. Then someone leaked the clubhouse security footage of her cutting my microphone and laughing about raccoons. Then someone else posted the side-by-side photos, the lush green hillside, in October versus the moonscape in December. Then the attendance at the next HOA meeting tripled furious homeowners waving printouts of my original emails. The final meeting was standing room only. One woman held up a photo of her daughter's swing set, crushed under a bull moose, and asked, voice shaking, "Who pays for this?" A man in a Carhartt jacket read aloud my very first warning email word for word, then looked straight at Karen and said, "Is this the expert you ignored?" Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She resigned the next morning at 6:03 a.m. via a one-sentence email. Rumors said she listed her house that afternoon. Others said she simply pulled every curtain and waited for the world to forget. It hasn't. The interim board was elected in an emergency vote 2 days later, open to every resident, no proxy nonsense, live-streamed on Zoom. Their first 3 actions: 1. Full restoration plan for the cleared slope funded out of the HOA's emergency reserves, and every penny of Karen's landscaping budget returned. 2. Permanent conservation easement on the entire northern boundary, recorded in perpetuity, no future development, ever. 3. A public apology read aloud at the next meeting and carved into a cedar plaque that now hangs in the clubhouse. We deeply regret the harm caused by the destruction of critical wildlife habitat. We acknowledge the warnings we dismissed and the suffering we inflicted on animals and neighbors alike. We commit to stewardship over control. I was offered the new permanent seat of environmental liaison. I turned it down. Not out of bitterness. I just don't want a chair at that table. I want the forest back. But I did agree to consult pro bono for as long as it takes. That spring, the saplings went in. 200 willow, spruce, birch, and alder, planted by volunteers who showed up with shovels and toddlers and thermoses of coffee. Children who had spent January terrified of moose now ran between the rows carrying watering cans. Someone brought a boombox playing Johnny Cash. Someone else grilled moose-shaped burgers as a joke, and we all laughed until we cried. I walked the line with Dr. Cho and pointed out exactly where the wind curled, where the snow drifted deepest, where the mothers liked to bed their calves. Nobody argued. Nobody rolled their eyes. They just listened, faces sunburned and open. By May, the first green haze appeared on the scarred slope. By June, the robins returned like they'd never left. One evening, I was locking the gate when I heard the soft rustle I hadn't dared hope for. She stepped out of the new willows like a memory made flesh, the limping cow now moving smooth and strong, flanked by her 2 yearlings nearly grown. She paused at the edge of my yard, ears swiveling, nostrils testing the air that finally smelled right again. I held my breath. She looked straight at me, calm, unafraid, and dipped her head once slow and deliberate, the closest thing to thank you the wild ever offers. Then she turned and melted back into the green with her children. I stood there until the mosquitoes found me, and the stars came out one by one. The land was breathing again, and for the first time in a long, cold winter, so was I. Spring arrived sideways that year, late, reluctant, and almost shy, as if the land itself was testing whether it was truly safe to wake up. The snow clung to the north slopes long after the calendar said it should have left. Frost still silvered the grass at dawn well into May. But underneath the crust, things were moving. Tiny green spears pushed through the torn earth where chainsaws had screamed only months earlier. Willow shoots no thicker than pencils unfurled their silver leaves overnight. The air began to smell of mud and resin and something new possibility. The restoration days became a ritual. Every Saturday morning, the parking lot filled with pickups and Subarus and minivans spilling out families in muddy boots. Someone set up a folding table with coffee urns and donuts. Someone else brought a Bluetooth speaker that played everything from Willie Nelson to Taylor Swift. Children who had spent January hiding from moose now chased each other between rows of saplings, shouting measurements like, "This one's taller than me already." I walked the line with Dr. Cho, and the first weekend pointing out the subtle dips where snow used to drift deepest, the exact angle the wind took across the slope, the places mothers had always chosen to drop their calves. People listened the way people listen after a near-death experience, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, taking notes on their phones. No one told me I was being dramatic anymore. The old floodlight rigs were dismantled piece by piece. The metal poles went to scrap. The bulbs were donated to the high school theater department. In their place, we planted clumps of serviceberry and mountain ash, whose berries would one day feed everything from waxwings to bears. The fence that Karen had ordered, the one meant to protect views, came down in a single afternoon. A dozen neighbors with pry bars and bolt cutters turned it into a pile of twisted aluminum in under an hour. Someone spray-painted "thank you" across the biggest section before it went to the dump. By mid-June, the slope looked less like a wound and more like a promise. The state wildlife team kept sending updates on the relocated animals. The calf with the broken leg, now nicknamed Lucky by the rehab staff, had been released with a yellow ear tag and a GPS collar. Every week I opened the tracking map and watched his little yellow dot wander the marshlands north of town, growing bolder, putting on weight, staying alive. Sometimes I whispered, "Good job, kid," to an empty kitchen, and felt foolish and proud at the same time. Then came the evening I will carry for the rest of my life. I was locking the gate after a long day of planting when the light turned that impossible Alaskan gold that only happens in late spring. The air smelled of warm pine needles and river water. I heard the softest rustle, the kind that could have been wind but wasn't. She stepped out of the new willow thicket like a queen returning to her throne. The limping cow now moving fluid and powerful, flanked by her 2 yearlings who had grown tall and sleek and almost arrogant. Behind them came 4 more, the scarred bull, a young cow with a white blaze, 2 new calves still spotted like fawns. They moved without hurry, pausing to browse the fresh growth we had planted, tearing off tender leaves with the satisfied sounds of animals who have decided the world is safe again. The scarred bull lifted his head and looked straight at me. I stood perfectly still, heart in my throat. He took 1 step forward, then another, until he was 10 feet away. Close enough that I could see the pale lightning scar catching the sun, close enough to smell his warm breath. He studied me for a long moment, ears forward, eyes calm. Then he dipped his massive head once, slow and deliberate, the way horses do when they finally trust the hand that feeds them. The others followed suit, small nods, flicking ears, relaxed tails. A quiet ceremony no human had scripted. I felt my eyes burn. I did not wipe them. I let the tears come because some moments deserve salt. When they moved on, melting back into the green like smoke, I stayed on the porch until full 10 minutes, afraid to breathe too loud and break the spell. That night, the neighborhood Facebook page, long silent, lit up with photographs. A bull napping beside the community mailbox. A cow and calf drinking from someone's koi pond. The owner posted, "Worth it." 3 juveniles using the new walking trail exactly the way it was meant to be used, only better. The caption on the most liked post read simply, "They're back. This time we're ready." And underneath, 312 hearts, 87 crying emojis, and 1 comment from an account named Karen Ashburn that simply read, "I'm glad." No one replied to her. No one needed to. The next week, the City Council passed a resolution commending our exemplary model of community-led ecological recovery. Conservation groups from 3 states asked for tours. A documentary crew from BBC Earth called. I told them the same thing I told everyone: the story isn't about me. It's about what happens when ordinary people remember they are not separate from the land, only temporary guests on it. One morning in July, I found a hand-painted rock on my porch step. Child's handwriting in bright blue. "Thank you for saving the mooses. Love, Emily, age 7. I put it on the windowsill where the sun hits it every morning. Some nights now, I sit on the porch with a beer and listen to the soft sounds of browsing, the occasional grunt, the quiet thud of hooves on new grass. The herd moves through the restored corridor, like they never left, only wiser. They bed down in the exact spots I pointed out to the volunteers, their bodies melting perfect ovals in the dew. And sometimes, when the light is just right, I catch a glimpse of the scarred bull standing sentinel at the edge of the trees, watching the houses the way he once watched the floodlights. Only now his ears are forward. Now his eyes are calm. Now he knows the difference between a threat and a promise kept. The land is healing. So are we. Years have passed since the chainsaws went quiet, but the story still walks the neighborhood on 4 long legs. Every November, the herd returns on the same cold wind that used to carry diesel fumes. They drift out of the spruce at dusk, like smoke given shape, pause at the edge of the restored thicket, and step into the willows we planted with our own hands. The scarred bull is grayer now, his antlers heavier, the lightning bolt scar now silver against black hide. Lucky the calf that once screamed on Brent's driveway is a broad-shouldered 4-year-old cow with her own spotted baby at her side. They move through the corridor without fear, browsing the exact saplings that children once carried in with muddy fingers, while parents took selfies and cried. The HOA is unrecognizable. Meetings are held outdoors now, weather permitting, on the slope itself. Folding chairs face the forest instead of each other. The agenda is short trail maintenance, bear-proof trash bins, and any new moose sightings to celebrate. Someone always brings cookies shaped like antlers. The president is a soft-spoken nurse named Marisol, who starts every session by reading the plaque Karen's board was forced to install. Respect the land, share the space, learn from what came before. Children who were toddlers during the invasion now lead school tours. They carry laminated maps, I drew pointing out bedding sites, and rubbing trees with the confidence of junior rangers. One spring, a second grader asked me, "Did the moose really win the war?" I told her they didn't win. They reminded us there was never a war to begin with. The cedar plaque in the clubhouse has been joined by others. A framed photo of the first volunteer planting day 127, smiling faces covered in mud. A shadow box containing the original Winter Landscape Optimization Initiative pamphlet next to a chunk of the mulched spruce that started it all. A bronze cast of Lucky's hoofprint taken the day she was released, captioned, "Forgiveness is a long road, but we're walking it." Karen's house sold quietly 2 summers ago. The new owners painted it forest green, tore out the ornamental grass, and planted native lupine that now feeds bumblebees the size of quarters. They left the mailbox alone. Someone had long ago sharpied moose crossing over the HOA logo, and it has never been repainted. My binder, the one that once weighed 20 pounds with rage, sits on a shelf in the restored clubhouse. It is open to the public. People flip through it sometimes, the ignored emails, the torn-down posters, the blood on Willow Drive, Karen's handwritten note folded small and soft from handling. I added a final page last year, a photograph of the herd browsing the new willows at sunset, every animal calm, every sapling taller than my head. Underneath, in my own handwriting, "We almost lost this. We chose not to." Some mornings, I walk the corridor before the sun is fully up. The air smells of wet moss and warm moose. I pass the rubbing tree where the scarred bull leaves fresh velvet every August, the patch of fireweed that grows exactly where the first bulldozer blade bit earth. The ground is soft under my boots now, no longer raw. Ferns have returned. So have the voles, the foxes, the ravens that used to vanish when the machines came. One dawn last October, I rounded the bend and found something that stopped my heart. A perfect circle of moose beds in the snow, 8 of them, arranged like petals around a single human boot print, my boot print, from the night before when I'd checked the trail cameras. In the center of the circle, someone or something had pressed a small pile of fresh willow twigs, neatly stripped of bark, placed exactly where I always sit to drink my coffee. I stood there a long time. Then I sat, drank my coffee cold, and left the twigs where they were. Because some conversations don't need words. Some thanks are older than language. The neighborhood still has HOA meetings dues, paint color approvals, and arguments about holiday lights. But the arguments are smaller now, and when someone starts to complain about messy nature, a dozen voices remind them gently but firmly of the winter the moose came to dinner. We kept the name North Edge Wildlife Sanctuary. It is on every real estate listing, every welcome packet, every school field trip permission slip. Property values, ironically, have never been higher. People move here now for the same reason I did, to live beside something larger than themselves. I still keep the binder. I still check the GPS dot that is lucky every week. I still sit on the porch some evenings with a beer and watch the herd move through the green like a slow-breathing prayer. And every year, on the anniversary of the day, the first chainsaw started, the entire neighborhood gathers at dusk on the restored slope. No speeches, no agenda. We simply stand in silence, while the moose walk past, close enough to touch, close enough to hear them breathing. Then someone, usually a child, starts to clap. The rest of us join in, not loud, not triumphant, just steady like a heartbeat. The moose never stop. They don't need to. They know they've already been heard. I am an old man now, or at least old enough that the mirror surprises me some mornings. The porch boards creak the same way my knees do, and the coffee takes longer to brew because I move slower. But the herd still comes every November right on schedule, and I still sit in the same Adirondack chair with the same chipped blue mug, watching the first dark shapes slide out of the spruce like the forest itself is breathing. The scarred bull died 2 winters ago. I found him in early March lying peaceful beneath the biggest willow we planted, snow drifted gently over his shoulders, antlers finally resting. He looked smaller in death than he ever had in life, but still immense. I sat with him until sunset, hand on the warm place where his neck met shoulder, and told him every secret I had left. The wildlife team came at dawn, wrapped him in canvas, and carried him out on a sled the way Vikings once carried their kings. We buried him at the top of the restored slope under a cairn of river stones. Wild roses grow there, now thick and red and defiant. Lucky took his place as matriarch. She wears the years like jewelry, silver hairs, tipped silver eyes calm, with the authority of a queen who has seen cities rise and fall. Her great-granddaughter, 4th generation born in our corridor, was born last spring in the exact spot where the first bulldozer blade bit earth all those years ago. I watched from a respectful distance, while the herd formed a living wall around mother and newborn ears, swiveling tails, flicking away flies the way guardians have done since glaciers carved this valley. The children who once hid from moose now guide them. On the first Saturday of every month, a dozen teenagers in green vests lead moose walks for newcomers, and school groups, tourists, even city council members from places that still think nature is something you visit on vacation. They carry my old maps, now laminated and dog-eared, and speak with the easy confidence of people who grew up believing wildness and neighborhood can share the same heartbeat. They know every individual by scar and gait and personality. They call Lucky Grandma without irony. The sanctuary has grown beyond anything we imagined. The easement now stretches 3 miles along the ridge, connecting our corridor to the state forest and the national park beyond. Beavers moved in 3 years ago and built a lodge you can see from the walking trail. Otters followed. Lynx prints appear some winters. Once a wolverine strolled down Maple Lane at 2 a.m., stared into a Ring camera like it was posing, and continued on its way. The video has 12 million views and counting. My binder is in a glass case in the clubhouse, now renovated clubhouse, open to the page with Karen's handwritten note and the photograph of the herd at sunset. Beside it sits the hand-painted rock Emily gave me when she was 7. She is 22 now, studying wildlife biology at UAF, and still signs every email, "Love the kid who believed you first." Some evenings I walk the corridor alone. The saplings we planted are trees now taller than my head, thick enough that moose disappear between them like ships in fog. Fireweed and lupine grow waist-high where raw dirt once bled. The ground is soft, spongy with decades of dropped needles and moose droppings working their ancient alchemy. I can close my eyes and almost hear the chainsaws, almost smell the diesel, but the memory is thin like a bad dream fading at sunrise. I still keep one ritual. Every year on the exact anniversary of the morning the machines arrived, I leave a small bundle of fresh willow twigs on the big flat rock where I used to sit with my coffee. I never see who takes them, but they are always gone by the next dawn, stripped clean, arranged in a neat pile, the way only moose can do, as deliberate and wordless as prayer. Last year, for the first time, the twigs were already there when I arrived. A perfect circle of 8 placed by someone with a mouth gentler than hands. In the center lay a single silver hair, long and coarse, catching the first light like a filament of moon. I picked it up, wrapped it in the same handkerchief I once pressed against a bleeding contractor's face, and carried it home. It lives now in the binder, pressed between the page that says, "We almost lost this," and the photograph of Lucky's great-granddaughter taking her first wobbly steps on ground that once ran red. Some stories end with victory parades and gavels. Ours ends quieter, with hoof prints in soft earth, with children who know the difference between fear and awe, with a neighborhood that learned the hard way, and the only way humans ever seemed to learn that the land was never ours to optimize. It was always theirs to share. And every November, when the first snow falls and the first dark shapes appear at the edge of the trees, I raise my chipped blue mug in the cold and whisper the only toast that still matters. Welcome home. The herd answers with silence, the deepest kind, the kind that holds everything. And the land, patient as ever, keeps the promise we finally remembered how to keep.